I want you to understand something before we go any further, because this story is going to require you to hold two contradictory feelings at once, and I'd rather you be prepared than blindsided. I am not the hero here. I'm not the villain either, though I'm sure there are people in my family who would contest that second part with considerable enthusiasm. I am the narrator. In the particular household where I grew up, that meant I was also the archivist, the apologist, the cautionary tale, and, on the days when the light came through the kitchen window at just the wrong angle, something close to invisible. My name is Maya Caldwell. That's my married name. The one on my office door, on my email signature, on the org chart for the Meridian Group's Human Resources Division, where I have served as director for the past 4 years. My name before that was Okonkwo, and if you said that name in certain zip codes in East Baltimore, people who knew my mother would nod slowly in a way that told you everything you needed to know about the kind of weight a surname could carry. The last document I signed in this capacity, the one that brought me to this story, the one I've been circling around for 12 years and didn't know it, was a standard reduction in force packet. 43 pages, 16 employees. Page 4, third name from the top. I'm going to explain how I got there. I'm going to tell you every single thing that led to that signature, because some stories don't make sense if you start them at the end, and some people don't make sense if you start them anywhere other than the beginning, at a row house on a street in Baltimore that smelled like Old Bay and regret, and the particular mildew of a house where the windows were never opened, because someone was always watching for who might be watching back. This is a witness statement. I've decided to give it to you. The row houses on our street in East Baltimore were the color of old brick, which sounds poetic until you understand that the color was less about aesthetics and more about whatever paint had been applied in 1987 and never refreshed. They sat in a long, continuous row, like teeth that had given up on alignment, each one pressed against its neighbor, sharing walls and sounds, and the faint smell of whatever the Hendersons were cooking 3 doors down. Our house was the 7th from the corner. I know this because I counted it every day walking home from school, using it as a kind of countdown, 7, 6, 5, 4. Each step a small negotiation between the version of myself that existed in the outside world and the version that was required inside. My mother, Sandra Okonkwo, ran our household with a precision that I would later recognize, from a professional remove, as a management style. Not a good management style, but a style nonetheless. Consistent, documented, enforced. She was a tall woman, darker than me, with the kind of posture that came not from confidence but from a lifetime of carrying things that should have been distributed more evenly. She was 31 when she had me, which meant that when I was 16, she was 47, and already moving through the world like someone who had calculated exactly how much disappointment a body could metabolize before it became structural. My father left when I was 5. I don't remember this as a dramatic event. I remember it the way you remember a piece of furniture being moved. One day the chair was there, and then it wasn't, and the space it left was just a space. My mother never spoke about him with grief. She spoke about him with the clipped, professional disapproval of someone reviewing a contractor who had delivered substandard work. He made choices, she would say. People make choices, and then they live with them. At the time, I thought she was talking about him. Later, I understood she was talking about herself. And even later than that, I understood she was, in some exhausting way, always talking about me. I had 2 older brothers, Darius, 5 years ahead of me, who joined the army at 18 and thereafter existed primarily as a photograph on the mantle and a voice on the phone that always sounded apologetic. And Theo, 3 years ahead, who never left, who got a job at the port, married his high school girlfriend, and settled into an East Baltimore life with the resigned comfort of a man who had decided that the known quantity of suffering was preferable to the unknown quantity of hope. I loved both of them in the distracted peripheral way you love people who are not your primary relationship with danger. They were fine. They mostly left me alone. In that household, being left alone was a significant gift. I was the youngest. I was the only girl. I was, and I say this with zero self-pity and approximately 18 years of retrospective clarity, the scapegoat. Not because I had done anything to earn the designation, but because someone in a system with that particular dynamic always has to hold the charge. And I had the double misfortune of being both perceptive enough to see what was happening and young enough that I couldn't yet leave. I noticed things. I said things I noticed out loud. This was my primary flaw as a child, and remains, my colleagues would probably tell you, an occupational hazard as an adult. What I noticed, from quite early on, was that my mother had two separate accounting systems for the people in her life. There was one for people outside the house, co-workers, church members, neighbors, the woman at the grocery store, for whom she maintained a careful, practiced warmth. And there was one for us, for the interior of number 7, where warmth was rationed like a resource she was saving for a winter that never quite arrived. For Darius and Theo, the ration was at least neutral, a baseline of benign neglect that I've since decided was its own kind of mercy. For me, it was something sharper, a specific attentiveness that felt, even when I was too young to name it, less like love and more like surveillance. She did not hit me. I want to be clear about that, because I'm about to describe something that sounds worse in certain ways, and I don't want the wrong story to lodge itself in your head. She did not hit me. What she did was notice every achievement I had and find, within it, the precise dimension of inadequacy that could be magnified. A 94 on a test became a referendum on the 6 missed points. A lead role in the school play became a meditation on the girls who had been passed over, and what it said about me that I was comfortable taking something other people wanted. An award, a compliment from a teacher, a friend who called the house and asked for me by name. All of it filtered through a critical apparatus so finely calibrated it could find the structural flaw in a diamond. I stopped telling her things by the time I was 11. I became, in the language of the therapist, I would eventually find in my late 20s, a highly functional secret keeper. I did well in school because school was the one space where the accounting system worked in my favor, where the points I earned stayed earned, where nobody could take them back. I read everything I could get from the public library 6 blocks away, which smelled beautifully of old paper and the industrial carpet cleaner the custodian used on Thursday afternoons and the faint ghost of every person who had ever sat in those chairs before me, escaping. I read about Baltimore history and East African history, and the history of labor movements, and the history of architecture, and the history of every single thing I could find that suggested the world was larger than a 7-row house walk from the corner. By the time I was in high school, I was something that my teachers handled with a kind of careful, deliberate attention, the way you handle something fragile that you're not entirely sure how it got there. My AP chemistry teacher, Mr. Donaldson, was the first adult who said to me directly, "You know you could go anywhere, right?" He said it after I'd stayed to rerun a titration because the result was 1 decimal point off from what I'd expected, which seemed to him like the behavior of someone for whom precision was a personality trait rather than a coping mechanism. He was not wrong on either count. I thanked him. I drove home on the bus and sat at the kitchen table and did not tell my mother about the conversation because I had learned that information about my own potential, shared in that house, was information that would be processed and returned to me at a later date, in a form I wouldn't recognize. I applied to 6 colleges. I told no one in my family that I was applying to any of them. I filled out the forms in the library after school and had the responses sent to a P.O. box I'd rented with babysitting money, $11 a month, which felt at the time like the most important financial transaction I had ever made. 5 of the 6 responded. 2 were acceptances with partial aid. 1 was a wait list. 1 was a flat rejection, which I folded carefully and dropped into the recycling bin at the library because I saw no reason to bring it home. And the 5th, the one I'd applied to last, the one I'd included on a kind of dare with myself, the one that felt like sending a message in a bottle in the direction of a coast you were not certain existed, the 5th was Johns Hopkins. And Johns Hopkins did not send me a response to my P.O. box. That is where this story actually begins. Let me tell you what I thought happened, and then I'll tell you what actually happened, because the gap between those two things is the entire 12 years I am about to account for. What I thought. I had been rejected. I had checked the P.O. box for 3 weeks and found nothing, and then 4 weeks, and then 6, and eventually I did what any rational person does when they have been waiting for something and it doesn't come. I constructed an explanation. I told myself the school was selective, that I'd known it was a reach, that the partial scholarship at University of Maryland, Baltimore County was a genuinely good option, and I should take it and be grateful. I enrolled. I deferred some grief I hadn't yet identified as grief. I moved into a dorm in the fall, and I did not look back at number 7 with anything more than the moderate relief of someone who has exited a room in which the air was bad. What actually happened? Johns Hopkins sent the letter to the house. I don't know when they sent it. I don't know exactly when it arrived. What I know, and I know this because I found out in the way that people find out inconvenient truths, which is to say, accidentally, in a conversation they were not expecting to be having, in a voice that was not their own, is that the letter arrived, and it was opened, and it was read, and it was put in the trash. The scholarship offer, a full one as it turned out, renewable, merit-based, tied to a program for first-generation college students from Baltimore City, went into the kitchen trash can at number 7, under the coffee grounds and the junk mail, and then into the green bin on the curb on Thursday pickup day, and then into the waste stream of the city of Baltimore, and is now, presumably, somewhere under the harbor, fully composted, gone. I found this out when I was 23. I had come home for Thanksgiving, one of the last times I would come home voluntarily, and Theo had already had 2 beers by the time I got there, which made him conversational in the specific way that people who are normally careful become conversational when they've decided that the maintenance cost of a secret has finally exceeded its value. We were in the kitchen. My mother was in the living room watching something loud. The kitchen smelled of roasting turkey and the particular industrial pine sol my mother had used since I was a child, and the old familiar mildew underneath it that no amount of pine sol had ever fully addressed. She threw it away, Theo said, not as a revelation, as a confession, as something that had been sitting in him for 6 years with nowhere to go. I looked at him. The Hopkins letter. She opened it. She knew what it was. He held his beer with both hands and looked at the table. I was here. I saw her do it. I didn't say anything. A pause. I was 19. I didn't know what to do. I stood in that kitchen for a moment that lasted from the inside, significantly longer than it did from the outside. The turkey was cooking. My mother was laughing at something on television. The pine sol and the mildew and the old bay from whatever she'd put on the turkey were all present, layered, competing, and I thought with a terrible clarity, she threw away my future. She opened it, she read it, and she put it in the trash. And then, because this is the thing about me, the fallibility you have maybe already started to see taking shape. I did not say anything either. I fixed my face. I poured myself a glass of water. I went into the living room and sat next to my mother and watched television for 2 hours. And when I left the next morning, I did not say goodbye. And I did not come back for Thanksgiving again. And I told myself, with the complete and devastating conviction of someone who has been doing this since the age of 11, that I was fine. I was not fine, but I was functional, which in my family was often the same thing. Here is what I want you to understand about the next 7 years, because I am going to compress them, and I don't want the compression to mislead you into thinking they were small. They were enormous. They were the years in which I built, from the materials available to me, a UMBC degree in Human Resources Management, a graduate certificate in Organizational Psychology, a grinding series of entry-level positions, and the particular focused energy of someone who has converted a childhood wound into a professional superpower. The career and the life that would eventually bring me to the moment I'm leading you toward. I was good at my job from the beginning, not in the showy conference circuit way of people who mistake charisma for competence. In the quiet, structural way, the way that meant I understood systems and how they failed, and how the failure was almost always obscured by the language used to describe it. Human resources is, at its foundational level, a discipline about documentation, about recording what people do and what happens to them and what the organization decides to do about it. I was, as we have established, a highly functional secret keeper and a person for whom precision was not optional. The career fit. I advanced steadily. HR generalist, then senior generalist, then HR business partner, and then, at 30, a phone call from the Meridian Group, which was looking for a director to run a newly consolidated HR function across its Baltimore campus. The Meridian Group, for context, is a mid-size healthcare administration and consulting firm headquartered in a glass and steel campus on the western edge of Baltimore County. The kind of campus that was built in the late 90s, optimism of suburban corporate expansion, and still carries, in its wide atrium lobby and its too ambitious art collection, the faint spirit of that particular era's belief that work could feel, with the right architecture, almost like aspiration. 4 buildings, roughly 800 employees, a cafeteria in Building C that serves about 300 people on an average lunch day, run by a food services management company under contract, staffed by a crew of 12 under the supervision of a manager. I accepted the job. I moved to a 2-bedroom apartment in Pikesville with my then-boyfriend Marcus, who would become my husband 18 months later and give me, among other things, the name on my office door. I started on a Monday in March. I was shown around the campus by the outgoing HR director, a soft-spoken man named Gerald, who shook my hand with the gravity of someone handing over an emergency kit, and I was introduced to my team and my office and the filing system that Gerald had maintained in a way that suggested he had never, in his entire career, thrown anything away. I did not know, on that Monday in March, that my mother worked in Building C. I did not find out for 11 months. This is the part I need you to sit with for a second, because I want to describe what it felt like from the inside, and I'm aware it is going to sound, from the outside, like something you'd find in a movie you'd only watch on a streaming service at 2 in the morning when your judgment is impaired. I know how it sounds. I am going to tell you anyway. It was a Tuesday in February, almost a year into the job. I had come down to Building C for a benefits presentation. We were rolling out a new supplemental insurance option, and I was doing the rounds of each building's all hands in person, because I had a policy, which Marcus teased me about, of never communicating anything consequential from behind an email. I was standing at the front of the Building C conference room, which overlooked the cafeteria through a glass partition, and I was fielding questions from a table of facilities and food services employees, and someone behind me said something about the coffee in the cafeteria being better than usual this week, and a woman across the table laughed and said, "That's Sandra for you. When she decides something needs to be fixed, it gets fixed." The name did not register consciously. It floated past me the way names do when they belong to a category you've mentally filed under. Not relevant here. I finished the presentation. I gathered my materials. I was walking back through the lobby toward the elevator when I passed the cafeteria entrance, and there was a woman in a food services uniform standing near the service window, directing someone about the placement of the warming trays, and she turned to reach for something on the counter, and I saw her face in profile. I want to give you the sensory detail here, because it is important and because it was the thing I was most aware of in the moment that followed. The cafeteria smelled of industrial coffee and the steam table warmth of whatever the lunch service was, something with rice, something with a sweetness to it, and the fluorescent lighting overhead was doing what fluorescent lighting always does, which is to make everyone look slightly more tired and slightly more real than they want to. My heels on the linoleum were too loud. I became very aware of my heels on the linoleum. She didn't see me. She turned back to the warming trays, said something to the worker beside her, laughed at whatever he said in response. A real laugh. Unguarded. Not the laugh she used for neighbors and church members. The actual one. The one I'd heard maybe 11 times in my life. She had aged. She walked with a slight favoring of her left side that she hadn't had 12 years ago. Her hair was shorter, fully gray at the temples now. She looked, I thought, with a clinical distance that arrived before the emotional reality could. She looked like she was tired in a way that had become structural. I got into the elevator and pressed the button for the 3rd floor, and stood with my back against the wall of the elevator, and breathed carefully for the 45 seconds it took to arrive. And then I walked into my office, and closed the door, and sat at my desk, and did not move for approximately 6 minutes. Then I opened Sandra Okonkwo's employee file. She had been with the food services contractor for 3 years, started 2 years before I'd joined. Building C cafeteria manager, hired at 59, which meant she was 62 now. Benefits eligible. Standard employment terms through the contractor's agreement with Meridian. Performance reviews. Satisfactory. Satisfactory. Exceeds expectations. The last one had a note from the contractor's regional supervisor. Sandra has significantly improved cafeteria service quality and team morale. Highly valued. I read the file 3 times. I closed it. I opened a document on my computer and stared at it for a while without typing anything. I thought about the P.O. box I'd rented for $11 a month. I thought about Theo in the kitchen, holding his beer with both hands. I thought about a Thursday trash day. I thought about the fact that I had, for the past 11 months, been approving benefits elections and policy updates and expense reports that applied to every employee on this campus, which meant that for 11 months I had been, without knowing it, the HR director responsible for the employment experience of the woman who had thrown away my scholarship letter. And then I did what I had been doing since I was 11 years old, when I first learned that the most effective response to impossible situations was not a dramatic one. I went back to work. I did not tell Marcus. This surprises people when I say it out loud, but it surprises them because they're thinking about it wrong. They're thinking about it as something I was hiding, when really it was something I was containing, which is different. Hiding implies shame. Containing implies structural necessity. The two things are technically compatible, but experientially distinct, and the distinction mattered to me. Marcus knew the outline of my history with my mother. He knew about the scholarship letter because I had told him, carefully, in the way you tell someone something when you've decided you trust them enough to let them hold a piece of the weight. He knew she was somewhere in Baltimore. He did not know she was in Building C. I told myself several things over the next few weeks, all of them reasonable, none of them entirely honest. I told myself that the professional boundary was actually the ethical thing, that knowing my mother worked here did not change my obligations under Meridian's HR policies, and that disclosing a family connection to an employee of a contractor might create more complications than it resolved. This was true. I told myself that my mother had no idea I worked here. Different building, different name, 12 years of estrangement, and that there was therefore no conflict of interest that required action. This was also true. I told myself that my job was to serve the organization and all its employees equitably, without favoritism or personal animus, and that I was capable of doing this because I was, professionally speaking, quite good at compartmentalization. This last part was true, and also, in the way of many true things I have told myself, incomplete. What I did not fully examine, what I folded carefully and stored in a drawer I didn't open, was the question of what it meant that I was making these decisions, that I was the person with the authority to make them, that in the architecture of this particular situation, I held a position that my mother had, in some essential way, spent my childhood insisting I would never occupy. And underneath that, quieter and colder and harder to look at directly, what it meant that her being here wasn't a threat to my position, or even really a complication. It was simply information. And I was very good at information management. I was also aware, in the way you're aware of a sound you can't identify, of something that was not quite satisfaction but was in the same building as it. I noticed it. I did not announce it to myself. I kept working. The reduction in force came out of a strategic review that had been in motion for most of my second year at Meridian. I'll spare you the corporate mechanics, or at least I'll spare you most of them, because some of them are necessary to understanding what happened and what didn't happen, and the distinction between those two things is the moral axis of this entire story. Meridian had acquired a smaller competitor 18 months earlier, and was now dealing with the integration, which had gone more or less as these things go. Considerably more expensive than projected, considerably slower, and productive of exactly the kind of organizational redundancy that eventually requires someone in my office to produce a spreadsheet with names on it. The directive came from the CFO and the COO jointly. We needed to reduce headcount by approximately 8% across non-clinical, non-essential functions. I was given a criteria framework, performance history, role redundancy, contractor versus direct employment, and told to produce a recommendation by end of Q3. I was given no specific names. I was given no specific functions to protect or target. The contractor employees, including the food services team, were technically subject to review as part of Meridian's overall campus footprint reduction, but they fell under a slightly different process. We would be renegotiating contractor agreements and could, under the terms of those agreements, request headcount reductions. I built the spreadsheet. I applied the criteria. I did not add to the criteria. I did not remove anyone from the pool who met the criteria. I did not add anyone who did not. Sandra Okonkwo's name appeared on the list because Building C's cafeteria was being scaled back. The organization had decided to close the full-service lunch operation in that building and convert to a grab-and-go model, which required a significantly smaller staff and, critically, did not require a full-time cafeteria manager. Her role was being eliminated, not her performance. The role. I want you to understand this clearly, because I have spent a significant amount of time understanding it clearly myself. I did not put her name on that list. The structural decision put her name on that list. I was the person who processed the list and made it official, but the list was, in its essential architecture, generated by forces that preceded and exceeded my personal feelings about my mother. I did not target her. I also did not pull her name off. This is the thing I am going to sit with you inside for a moment, because I think it is the most important room in this whole house. I had the standing to flag a conflict of interest. I could have disclosed the family connection and recused myself from the portion of the RIF that touched the contractor employees. I could have had a colleague handle that section of the review. I did not do these things. I told myself, accurately, that doing so would have required explaining a relationship I had not disclosed for 14 months, and that the explanation would have been complicated, and that ultimately my management of the process was fair. All of this was true. The question I planted in my own chest, around this time, the one I carried forward through the remaining weeks of the process, the one I still carry now. Was it fair? Or was it just defensible? Those two things are not the same. I know that. The law, largely, cares about the second. I have spent most of my adult life learning to care about the first. I am still working out which one I applied here. I'm going to tell you about the day I signed the packet, and then I'm going to tell you something that happened 3 days after. And then I'm going to tell you what all of it means, or what I think it means, which at this distance is the closest I can honestly get to the truth. It was a Thursday. This detail is not lost on me. Thursdays in East Baltimore were trash days, and I have not been neutral about Thursdays since I was 23 years old, and I'm aware that the universe doesn't actually arrange its irony for our benefit. But I'm also aware that the brain finds patterns in random data with the enthusiasm of someone who desperately needs a pattern, and my brain is not exempt from this tendency just because I know it's happening. I had been in the office since 7. The packet had been reviewed by legal, by the CFO, by the contractor's regional HR lead. 43 pages. Standard language. Role elimination. Effective date. Severance calculation based on years of service. COBRA continuation information. Outplacement services referral. The severance for a 3-year contractor employee at Sandra's level and salary was 11 weeks. 11 weeks of pay. $438 a week, gross. It was the standard formula. I had not altered it upward or downward. Page 4. Third name from the top. Sandra A. Okonkwo, cafeteria manager, Building C. I sat with that page for a while. My office has a window that looks out over the parking lot, and in the distance you can see the edge of the Patapsco River Valley before the land flattens out toward the city. It was a gray morning, not dramatically gray, not cinematically gray, not the kind of gray that announces itself as meaningful. Just the flat, institutional gray of a mid-autumn Baltimore day, the kind of gray that has no ambitions beyond keeping the temperature slightly too cold for a coat but slightly too warm for the one you already own. I thought about the kitchen at number 7, the pine sol, the old bay, the mildew underneath. I thought about my mother standing at the warming trays, laughing the real laugh. I thought about Theo with his beer and the look on his face. Not guilt exactly, but the expression of someone who has been carrying something too long and finally had to set it down somewhere, and the relief and the shame of that were indistinguishable. I thought, she threw away my future. I am processing her past, and I signed the page. The signature took about 3 seconds. My handwriting, on official documents, is precise and small. It occupies its line without overflow or excess. I moved on to page 5. I finished the packet. I forwarded it to legal. I responded to 3 emails and made a note about the outplacement services timeline. And then I sat back in my chair and felt, this is the honest part. Not satisfaction, not triumph, not the clean narrative resolution that this kind of story is supposed to deliver. I felt the particular quality of quietness that comes after you've done something you have been approaching for a very long time, and the approach turns out to have been more significant than the arrival. It was done, and it felt like almost nothing, and that almost nothing was the loudest thing in the room. 3 days later, my colleague Deb, my HR coordinator, who handled the contractor-employee communications and had been working the Building C transition, knocked on my office door around 4:30 and leaned in with the expression she had when something didn't quite add up for her. "Hey," she said. Random question. "Do you know the cafeteria manager, Sandra Okonkwo?" I set down my pen. Why? She came in today to process her paperwork. Deb had a way of narrating things with a slight upward tilt, as if each sentence were a question she was asking herself at the same time. She was really, I don't know, composed. She thanked me. She said she understood. She asked me to make sure the outplacement contact was good because she wanted to get started right away. A pause. She also said something kind of, I don't know. She said, Deb looked at her notepad, "Tell whoever runs this place that the coffee will be worse now." And then she laughed. I looked at Deb. My face did what my face does, which is to remain entirely still while the interior moves at a considerable speed. "She sounds like she handled it well," I said. "Yeah." Deb nodded. Then, "She was talking to me while she was signing the forms and she mentioned her daughter. Said her daughter was in HR somewhere in Baltimore." Deb tilted her head. Said she was proud of her. A beat, which was sweet. She seemed like a person who doesn't usually say things like that. I picked up my pen. "Good," I said. "That's good." Deb left. I sat in the office until the sky outside turned from gray to the particular dark of early November, and the parking lot lights came on, orange and steady, and the river valley at the edge of my view became just a line of black against a less black sky. Said she was proud of her. I have rotated that sentence in my mind many hundreds of times now. I have looked at it from every angle I can reach. I have asked myself what it means and what I'm allowed to let it mean, and what it would cost me to let it mean any of the things it might mean. I have been unable to come to a conclusion that satisfies me, and I have come to suspect that this is not a failure of analysis, but a feature of the question. That some things are not resolved, they are simply carried, and the carrying is the work. Did she know? Did she piece it together? The name on the building directory, some piece of administrative overlap, someone's offhand reference? Or did she not know, and the thing she said to Deb was just a woman in her 60s, signing away 3 years of work, reaching for a piece of warmth from somewhere? I have no evidence either way. I chose not to look for evidence. The choice to not look is itself a kind of decision, and I've made my peace with it having been mine to make. What I know. She was proud of her daughter somewhere in Baltimore. That statement exists in the world, spoken to a stranger on the day she signed her severance, and it is either the most ironic thing that has ever happened to me, or it is the most human, and I am genuinely unsure which of those I'm supposed to want it to be. I went home that evening to the apartment in Pikesville that Marcus and I had turned, over the years, into something that I can only describe as unambiguously mine. Not ours, though it was his too, but mine in the deeper sense of a space that bears the evidence of a self that was assembled entirely from scratch, without inheritance, without the foundation of a childhood home that was safe to return to. The bookshelves, the good coffee maker, the framed print above the desk that says, in very small text, "The quality of a decision is not determined by its outcome. Marcus had given me that, with appropriate sarcasm, after a particularly difficult quarter at work. I keep it because it is funny and because it is also, in a particular light, a philosophy I have tried to live. He was making dinner when I came in. He asked me how it was. I told him the RIF packet was signed, and that things were moving to implementation. He nodded. He didn't ask for details. He has learned over years that I process things in a specific order, and that the processing happens before the sharing, and that the way to love me is to be present for the sharing and not to push on the processing. I sat on the kitchen counter the way I have always done when we cook, which drives him crazy because of where the counter edge hits his hip, and I watched him cook for a while. "You know what I've been thinking about?" I said eventually. "I never know what you've been thinking about," he said, which was accurate. "Compost," I said. He looked at me. "How long it takes," I said, "for something to actually break down, like the chemistry of it." He stirred whatever he was stirring and considered this. "That's not what you're actually thinking about," he said. "No," I said, "but it's related." He let it go. That's one of the things I love about him. He lets things be related and doesn't demand that I explain the connecting tissue before I've found it myself. Here is what I have found, over the months since the packet was signed, and the cafeteria in Building C became a grab-and-go operation, and Sandra Okonkwo processed out of the Meridian Group with 11 weeks of severance and a referral to an outplacement service she apparently used promptly. I did not feel what I thought I would feel. Or rather, I felt a version of it so diluted by time and distance and professional architecture that it barely registered as feeling at all, and the absence of the expected feeling was itself a kind of answer to a question I'd been asking for a long time. I thought revenge was supposed to feel like something. Maybe not Hollywood revenge. Maybe not the clean, operatic satisfaction of a cinematic payoff, but something. A closing. A door finally shutting. Instead, what I got was quieter and stranger and in some ways harder to metabolize. The feeling of having completed a process, of having moved something from one column to another, received, filed, archived. She threw away my future. I processed her past. I've turned that formulation over and over, looking for the thing in it that should make me feel better or worse, and what I keep arriving at is the same place. It's not a revenge narrative. It was never going to be. The person who needed to be confronted was the person who stood in a kitchen in East Baltimore and chose to put a letter in the trash. That confrontation never happened. It still hasn't. What happened instead was something parallel. An accounting that took place entirely in the ledger of my own life, invisible to its subject, administrative in its execution, impersonal in its method and intensely personal in everything underneath. I am aware that this is not a satisfying resolution. I am aware that the story you were expecting had a scene in it, a confrontation, a recognition, a moment where the mother sees the daughter in the hallway of the corporate campus and the whole 12 years collapse into a single expression. I did not give you that scene because it did not happen, and I am not interested in giving you a fiction dressed in the clothes of a true story. What happened was more banal and more precise, and I think, more honest about how these things actually go. Here is what I want to say about the system, because the systemic reflection is the part I promised you, and it's the part that I mean most seriously. This is not a story about a daughter who got revenge on her mother. That would be too small. What this is a story about how the damage done in a row house in East Baltimore in 1997, a decision made by a woman who was herself trapped, who had herself been failed, who looked at her daughter's potential and felt not pride but a threat she couldn't name. How that damage rippled forward for 12 years and expressed itself. Finally, not as a confrontation, but as an administrative process, The families we come from shape our relationship to power. Specifically, the families we come from teach us, very early, whether the people who have authority over us will use it to protect us or not. I learned, at a desk in a library that smelled of carpet cleaner and old paper, that the answer in my case was not. I learned to build systems around that absence, to become the authority, to manage the process, to be the person in the room with the spreadsheet. And I did. I built that career from nothing. I earned every credential. I sat in every difficult conversation. I signed every difficult document. And when my mother's name appeared in column A, I applied the criteria, and I made the call, and I processed the paperwork. And somewhere in the doing of that, I completed a transaction that had been open for 12 years. I am not proud of everything in this story. The part where I didn't disclose the conflict of interest, I would counsel any employee of mine differently. The part where I sat in that kitchen at Thanksgiving and said nothing to my mother's face, I have thought about that one for a long time. The part where I don't know whether to believe she was proud of me, and I chose not to find out. I think about that on Thursdays. I am also not ashamed of having survived it, of having taken the fractured foundation I was given and built something solid on it by force of will and precision, and $11 a month for a P.O. box and every other unglamorous incremental act of self-construction that separates the person I was going to be in that house from the person I became outside it. My mother is 62 and out of work. I am 32 and employed. These facts exist in the world simultaneously and without commentary from me on what they mean for her, or for me, or for the question of fairness that I apparently cannot stop asking. The outplacement service she used was a good one. I know because I selected the contract. The severance was 11 weeks. The criteria was applied consistently. The process was clean. The question I planted in Act 3, the one I told you would only be answered later, was whether my mother knew. Whether, in the weeks before the severance was processed, some administrative breadcrumb had led her from Building C to the name on the third-floor office, and she had understood. Whether the woman who sat in Deb's office and signed her forms and said she was proud of her daughter in HR had any idea who was, on the other side of the building, on the other side of the glass, in the carpeted quiet of an HR director's office, processing her termination. I told you I chose not to look. That's still true. I'm keeping that choice. Not because I'm afraid of the answer. I've been afraid of harder things. But because some questions, when answered, close a door you weren't ready to close. The possibility that she knew and said it anyway, that she offered pride she'd never been able to give directly, offered it to a stranger about a daughter she didn't know was there. That possibility is a thing I'm not ready to let become a fact. And the possibility that she didn't know, that she went home with her 11 weeks of severance, and her referral letter, and her dignity intact, having never been exposed to what she helped set in motion. That is also a thing I'm not ready to resolve. Some people will read this and see a daughter who got the last word without speaking. Some people will see a daughter who still couldn't make herself say anything, even from a position of power, and who found a way to call that composure. Both readings are available. I've made mine. I'm not going to tell you which one it is. Here is the last thing I will tell you, and I mean it the way I mean everything I mean. Precisely, with no excess, and no apology for the weight of it. The Johns Hopkins letter composted under the harbor 14 years ago, and I built something from scratch in its absence, and the building was mine. And when my mother's name came to my desk, I gave her the same standard she would have gotten from anyone. That's the whole story. She threw away my future. I processed her past. And the difference between those two sentences, the difference in what they say about who we each became, is the only closing argument I have, and it is the one I am prepared to live with. For questions about layoffs, HR process, or outplacement resources. See the links below. If you're building something from a difficult foundation, you already know you have to keep going. That's enough.